Joseph Smith and the Galactic Order, an essay on extraterrestrials in American religion. Within the cosmology of literalist Latter-day Saints, heaven, or the celestial kingdom, is seen as a real place which exists in space and time. Lynn M. Hilton writes, "It consists of gigantic stars, Kolob plus others, at the center, each radiating with great energy and power at the center of our galaxy. This celestial zone, a sphere at the center of our galaxy, is occluded from direct visual observation by a veil of interstellar dust. Our living goddess Earth, which, quote, has a spirit, can talk and keep God's commandments, and will finally be exalted in the celestial kingdom, was spun free from the Cobalt star at the center of this celestial zone hundreds of thousands of years ago. Earth then passed through the telestial zone, across another obscuring band of interstellar dust into the terrestrial zone, where we abide today. Each of these three zones has its own associated heavenly realm. Outside the galaxy is the frozen hell of planets where evildoers are punished by devils for the sins they committed in terrestrial life. The Kolob theorem, a Mormon's view of the starry universe, does not mention Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish scientist turned prophet, whose voluminous works prefigured the three-tiered heaven of Joseph Smith. Swedenborg is nevertheless present in Hilton's text. Knowingly or unknowingly, he restates Swedenborg's doctrine of correspondences. Quote, things on this earth are patterned after or even descended from heavenly originals, and we can understand heaven in part by studying this earth, Hilton explains. Swedenborg was in turn restating the motto of modern Hermeticism, as above, so below, as below, so above. Hilton, like the legendary Johnny Appleseed Chapman before him, is an earnest believer in Christ who is wholly unconscious that he is transmitting ideas originating in occultism. There never was a time when there were not gods and worlds, and when men were not passing through the same ordeals that we are now passing through, Brigham Young asserted in the Deseret News during 1859. By then, the new church had declined, but the new American religions were using revised visions of Swedenborg's modern heaven, which was filled with peoples living on planets. Hilton, nevertheless, ascribes the origin of this cosmology to a unique divine inspiration. Quote, the prophet Joseph Smith had a clear understanding of God's universe. He described it in astonishing detail in the 1840s AD, Hilton believes. During 1832, Smith and Sidney Rigdon, his principal scribe, quote, asked the Lord the meaning of John 5:29 concerning the resurrection of the just and unjust. The answer from the Lord is now recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, as the vision of the 3 degrees of glory, that is, the 3 different heavens and associated afterlives. However, Mormon historian Lucy Mack Smith has established that Rigdon was exposed to Swedenborg before he ever met Joseph Smith. Historian Michael Quinn has likewise established that Swedenborg's translated books and pamphlets were widely available around Palmyra, New York, where Smith lived when he received his first revelation. Smith was known to fraternize with other followers of Swedenborg who converted to his new faith. Smith even directly mentioned Swedenborg in an 1839 conversation with Edward Hunter at his National Seminary in Philadelphia. The doctrines of Swedenborg's new church, including his idea that people live on other planets, were therefore already as American as apple pie. Like any prophet, Smith simply drew from the cultural material around him at the time, a spiritual phenomenon called bricolage. His American audience had expectations to fulfill if he was to succeed as a prophet. Our reading of Lynn Hilton's Kolob theorem does not require any argumentation against the beliefs of Mormons. On the contrary, Hilton acknowledges that a diversity of views about the nature of the universe exists among Mormons themselves. So, although it is replete with scriptural references, Hilton's text is still not necessarily an authoritative or representative sample of what individual Mormons actually believe. Rather, his book exemplifies the process of literary transmission by which Swedenborg's spiritual ideas remain alive today, even though the Swedish prophet's name is almost forgotten and his church tiny, while the Latter-day Saints thrive. Discussing spiritual travel through space, Hilton quotes the lyrics of the Mormon hymn, "If Ye Could Hie to Kolob," first published in the Deseret News during 1856. Read literally, it describes faster-than-light travel, if not teleportation. That is, the twinkling of an eye. Quote, "Travel between various places in God's kingdom can be done by spiritual beings at or near the speed of thought," Hilton says. Angels can travel faster than light. We know this, Hilton says, because the Earth is tens of thousands of light years from Kolob, yet prayers can be answered in an instant. Souls are dispatched from Kolob to join their earthly babies in an instant. This is another restatement of Swedenborg, who wrote in 1758 that, quote, "Spaces, distances, and consequently movement from place to place in the spiritual world are, in their origins and first causes, inner changes of state." Thus, the Swedish prophet could travel to extrasolar planets in a matter of hours to days rather than light years. The sheer orderliness of Hilton's universe is probably the single most Swedenborgian aspect of Kolob theorem. Swedenborg was a scientist as that word was understood in the 18th century, and his scientific reputation added gravitas to his spiritual writings. Much of what passed for science at the time was to be cast aside as pseudoscience while the scientific method was being invented. Reading Swedenborg today is therefore an embarrassment, for his text is filled with sciency, wyancy descriptions of the universe that do not match our observed reality, such as people living on Mercury, Venus, and the Moon. Likewise, Hilton quotes astronomers at length to support his galactic geography. Quote, "The terrestrial and telestial kingdoms are located in successive concentric, donut-shaped rings round about the celestial kingdom or central hub of the Milky Way galaxy." End quote. But his self-published book is not going to pass a peer review by modern astronomers. It is instead a work of apologetics. Set aside the astronomical arguments, however, and we are left with Hilton's sincere Mormon belief about the structure and order of the universe. We ignore Swedenborg's absurd descriptions of Jupiter and Mars to understand what he believed about God. Likewise, we can also take Hilton at his word about what he believes about God. He believes that gravitation is God's own power to shape matter, and Kolob is a supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. A second force of God's nature, the governing power, Keivan Rosh of Kolob, is, quote, "the degree of light cheering the face of millions of planets" in Smith's Egyptian alphabet and grammar. A kind of dark energy, this invisible force, re-energizes stars and planets and the people who live on them. Our particular god, Elohim, Hilton's spelling is different, is responsible for the Milky Way galaxy alone among all galaxies, all of which have different gods, he says. God had a father, in Smith's telling. This polytheistic notion has always made Smith's new religion controversial. Indeed, it raised controversy while he was alive. A universe full of deities governing planets and their afterlives further challenges monotheism. The three-tiered heaven, a la Swedenborg, was also too much for some early Mormons. Today, many ex-Mormons cite their study of Smith's cosmology, his multiplicity of gods, and his progression of human souls to godhood as the starting point of their disbelief in the Mormon Testament. Yet Hilton embraces these same features, for they are not bugs to him. They order the universe, ordinate his life, and animate him with epistemic purpose. Hilton's literalism is downright Swedenborgian. Quote, "God himself lives in a real place, composed of actual materials on a crystal sphere, a great Urim and Thummim," he writes of his literal heaven in the literal heavens. If the galaxy is real, then God is real, and then Lynn Hilton knows who he is. Quote, "Considerable and astonishing detail about this barrier between the earth and heaven is offered in the prophet Joseph's Egyptian alphabet and grammar. His comments, recorded under the heading Fifth Degree of Phlosisis, reads, quote, "God has said, let this be a center for light, and let there be bounds that it cannot pass. He hath set a cloud round about in the heavens, and the light of the grand governing, 15 fixed stars center there. So God has set the bounds of light, lest it pass over and consume the planets." Consider that nearly 150 years ago, long before science had any idea of the structure of the universe, God's prophet said that there exists, quote, "clouds round about in the heavens for bounds of light, from the concentrated emissions, quote, of the 15,000 stars in the center place, and that the purpose of these clouds is to keep the planets from being consumed. What profound insight! We stand with awe and respect for Joseph's prophetic powers. Hilton has made a virtue of his bad astronomy. Recapitulating Swedenborg, the universe proves God as God proves the universe, as above, so below, as below, so above. Godhood in the afterlife of the saints comes with godlike powers. Brigham Young described this heavenly transmigration in an 1872 sermon. Quote, "We cannot receive, while in the flesh, the keys to form and fashion kingdoms, and to organize matter, for they are beyond our capacity and calling, beyond this world. In the resurrection, men who have been faithful and diligent in all things in the flesh, have kept their first and second estates, and worthy to be crowned gods, even the sons of God, will be ordained to organize matter. How much matter do you suppose there is between here and some of the fixed stars which we can see? Enough to frame many, very many millions of such earths as this, yet it is now so diffused, clear, and pure that we look through it and behold the stars. Yet the matter is there. Can you form any conception of this? Can you form any idea of the minuteness of matter?" At the time, Young was contending with the sons of Joseph Smith and Emma Beidman, who are mentioned in this discourse, for leadership of the saints. 28 years after the death of Joseph Smith, Young asserted that through the providences of God, we have apparently advanced faster since then than in the 14 years before, so far as bringing the people into note and giving them a name and fame in the eyes of the world. Thus, Young promised this future control of matter and the ability to shape planets in the afterlife to his followers, whereas the followers of false prophets could expect no such reward. As Dante Alighieri understood in his Divine Comedy, a hierarchical afterlife is a terrific way to punish your enemies. Like his prophet, Young refers to stars as fixed. We now know that everything in the universe is in motion relative to everything else, that no star is fixed to any position anywhere. At the time, however, astronomical observation had not yet detected the movement of stars, nor learned to see the red and blue Doppler shifts of light from distant objects. When Young spoke of matter between the stars, science was still trying to detect something called ether in outer space. The vacuum theory of interstellar medium was not incontrovertibly proven, nor the limits of the atmosphere established until the 20th century. Young calls interstellar matter diffused, clear, and pure because this debate about the properties of outer space was both unresolvable and explicitly spiritualized. One potential source of Young's ideas about interstellar space may be the principles of nature, her divine relations, and a voice to mankind, by and through Andrew Jackson Davis, which was published by the titular spiritualist in 1852. As we shall see in a future essay, Davis was not simply inspired by Swedenborg, but claimed to receive guidance from his ghost during seances. Lightly modifying Swedenborg's cosmology of the solar system, Davis termed all of material creation the universalum. Everything we see in the universe is, quote, "a boundless accumulation of particles that have assumed by virtue of inherent qualities, forms, orders, degrees, associations, and correspondences." Every particle, from the first to the last circle, gravitated to the center destined for its association. Thus were established forms, and perpetual forms produced order. And by the association of each particle through the vast universalum, with particles of like affinity from the lowest to the highest, degrees were established throughout every department of creation. And there was a constant gravitation of particles going on throughout the whole mass of material compositions, and thus in order was produced this vast and universal extension of worlds and systems of worlds throughout immensity of space. Like Smith's Kolob, Davis writes that a, quote, great sun at the center of the Milky Way is pushing light energy out to lesser suns, which light up and energize the planets on which beings live. This central star is, quote, an unimaginable ocean of liquid material, from which, according to the development of its atmosphere, which extended throughout immensity, rolled forth a circle of suns to the extreme extent of particles associating to produce them. Thus also order and form were developed. At the creation of the universe, Davis says, the relative density of stars thus depended on, quote, their distance from the great sun, their parent, which was in proportion to the density of their composition. And their distances from each other were correspondingly sustained by the same influence of eternal gravitation. The density of planets likewise depended on their distance from the Sun. Saturn had such low density, Davis said, that its inhabitants were practically ethereal themselves. Human understanding of the universe kept changing, however, so faith had to change with it. Galaxies were mere puzzling smudges in early photographic astronomy. By studying Cepheid variables in the Andromeda Galaxy, however, in 1923 Edwin Hubble determined that our galaxy is but one spiral in an expanding universe full of galaxies. Acknowledging this new understanding that Smith could not have, Hilton invokes the lyrics of Phelps's hymn once again. Quote, we postulate that each of these many galaxies is governed by its own God, who is striving to bring eternal lives to his offspring, Hilton writes. Quote, the Kolob theorem holds that the Milky Way galaxy may be in a grand orbit about Elohim's father's galaxy, which in turn is in orbit about the galaxy belonging to Elohim's father's father, and so on, ad infinitum. He speculates the galactic clusters we observe in the heavens are a reflection of the, quote, patriarchal order among the gods. Hilton inflates the divine cosmology of Smith in order to make it fit the new size of the observable universe. Past and future are understood from the present. Quote, our planet Earth was first formed in an orbit of Kolob in the celestial core of the galaxy. It migrated out through the terrestrial ring, the Garden of Eden period, and took up its present position in an orbit of the Sun for its mortal telestial probation, Hilton says. Quote, the Earth will return by being pulled away from the Sun, passing again through the terrestrial ring, the millennial period, and finally regaining its original glorious orbit around Kolob in the celestial kingdom. Altogether, the temporal existence of Earth is supposed to last 6,000 years. Then, quote, just before the second coming of Christ, the Earth will leave its orbit about the Sun, causing great physical upheavals, and pass through the veil into the terrestrial region. The Earth and its people will meet the Lord and enjoy 1,000 years of paradisical glory. Set aside our questions. Wouldn't the Earth be accelerating past the speed of light in this scenario? And we are left with the belief itself. At the conclusion of this joyful millennium, quote, the Earth will pass through another veil into the celestial kingdom. The Earth will be celestialized and changed into a great Urim and Thummim and receive a celestial glory. It will resume its former orbit around Kolob in the celestian core of the galaxy, thus fulfilling the restoration of all things. It will remain in this position forevermore. 1 year on Kolob is equal to 1,000 years on Earth. To any student of 19th century American religion, this is recognizable as millennial dispensationalism. Introduced by the Plymouth Brethren in the 1830s, the idea that history is divided into divinely inspired spiritual epochs or dispensations, each receiving new guidance from God for a new age more advanced than the last, had worldwide impact. It also jibed well with the new millennialism of William Miller, who predicted the Second Coming in 1844 and accidentally created Seventh-day Adventism. Today, Protestant Christians who are concerned with eschatology, the study of end times, still debate whether the millennium of peace comes before or after the Second Coming. Hilton has resolved that debate with his story of where Earth is going next. Neither Swedenborg nor Smith mentioned spaceships, for such things were not part of their imaginarium. Rather than dream of a hyperdrive, Hilton has decided the Earth itself is a kind of spaceship, and we will all be going for this ride one day. It is unclear just where Joseph Smith got the name Kolob. The Latter-day Saints admit the weaknesses of all the linguistic explanations offered so far. This is related to the problem of sources, for Smith translated the Book of Abraham from an Egyptian funerary scroll. Of course, what Smith meant by translation was not the study of hieroglyphics, but a divine revelation. Quote, sources indicate that Joseph professed that the translation of the Book of Abraham came by revelation and the gift and power of God. So while Joseph appears to have used the word translation to describe the Book of Abraham as meaning the conversion of an ancient text into modern English, the means or methods he used to accomplish this translation were uncommon by conventional academic standards, namely, revelation. By his own account, Smith no longer possessed the Urim and Thummim, the seer stones through which he had translated the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, for the angel Moroni had taken them away. None of Smith's papyri have survived either. Moreover, quote, clues from the Book of Abraham text suggest that the prophet felt free to continually adapt and revise his initial translation. For example, some of the names of the characters in the Book of Abraham were revised in 1842, shortly before its publication. Likewise, Joseph Smith's study of Hebrew appears to have influenced the final form of the text, because his knowledge of such evidently influenced how he either initially rendered or later revised certain words and phrases in the Book of Abraham's creation account. At the same time the Plymouth Brethren were propagating dispensationalism, Smith was receiving the Book of Moses through direct revelation. Quote, "But only an account of this earth, and the inhabitants thereof give I unto you," God tells a transfigured Moses. "For behold, there are many worlds that have passed away by the word of my power." Worlds, plural, because the belief that the universe is filled with worlds full of people was not unusual among the learned in early America. Indeed, Smith lived in the New World, in a new country still figuring out its identity and place in the world, as the world began coming to America in droves. 2 wars had secured American independence from Britain and allowed frontier expansion. New cities on that frontier were named for exotic eastern locales that Americans only ever read about. These were often located in states with Native American names. Mecca and Medina in Ohio, Cairo in Missouri, Memphis in Tennessee. America was becoming the melting pot where a world of spiritual ideas came to mix and take new form. "There is no end to race," go the lyrics of the hymn. Mormon religion happened in a period when the so-called science of race had run far ahead of the development of the scientific method. In the early 19th century, the word race still referred to a recognizable nation or ethnic group. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, followed 6 years later by Gregor Mendel's foundational paper on genetics. Experiments on plant hybridization have altered the way we understand racial difference. However, at the time, these seeming breakthroughs were feeding a new phenomenon: scientism. In between Darwin and Mendel, the United States fought a bloody civil war over racial slavery, with Utah affirming their loyalty to the Union. Afterwards, Mormons were normalized as a race of Americans. The Book of Mormon presents the lost tribes of Israel as a race that migrated to North America by crossing the Atlantic Ocean centuries before Christ. Here again, we find that previous writers had spread this idea for a very long time. In fact, they spread it while they were inventing race. Quote, "There were many lost tribes writings in the 16th and 17th centuries, for a number of Spaniards in America were glad to have the excuse to relegate the Aborigines to the miserable status of European Jews," Robert Washup writes. Since anthropology as a science was non-existent in those days, the missionaries, historians, and other travelers exploring the rapidly expanding known world were constantly amazed at similarities they found in ways of life between hitherto unknown tribes and those already familiar to them through biblical stories. Scientific record-keeping did not exist, and early scientists, quote, "unaware of how similar outcomes can develop independently of each other, were usually inclined to attribute them to historical connections." Early 17th century French explorer Marc Lescarbot, quote, "concluded that the New World was peopled not by Israelites, but by Canaanites, whom the former had themselves expelled. He stated flatly that Americans are descendants of Noah." Josiah Priest, in his American Antiquities, 1798, attempted to show that America was settled before the flood, that it was the country of Noah, and the place where the ark was erected. However, Priest said that the famous Indian mounds at Marietta on the Ohio River were the ruins of a Roman fort. Others, like the 18th century frontier figure James Adair, bent every syllable out of shape to convince themselves that Native American words were Hebrew in origin. Against this background, the Book of Mormon's story of Israelites splitting into Nephilites and Lamanites after a cross-oceanic migration does not stand out as unique or strange. Rather, the lost tribes are another element of Joseph Smith's bricolage. Americans were his primary audience, and they wanted him to explain America in his revelation. They wanted a present that was grounded in a past and pointed towards a future. Smith offered them a story to explain it all. In 1845, 1 year after Joseph and his brother Hiram were murdered by a mob in Carthage, Illinois, newsman John O'Sullivan wrote a Declaration of Independence from world history. America could not be bound by it, he wrote, for the young nation, quote, is destined for better deeds. The far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred and the true. Its floor shall be a hemisphere, its roof the firmament of the star-studded heavens, and its congregation an union of many republics, comprising hundreds of happy millions, calling, owning no man master, but governed by God's natural and moral law of equality, the law of brotherhood, of peace and goodwill amongst men. O'Sullivan wrote as Texas annexation loomed. He decried foreign interference in the matter. European empires, particularly Britain, were holding Americans back from, quote, our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, he said. A year later, the United States went to war with Mexico. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and some minor modifications later, the lower 48 states of America assumed their current shape. The frontier of Johnny Appleseed had long since become the bustling Midwest. Now the western frontier beckoned, and beyond it the Pacific, as Brigham Young led his people west to Utah and founded a new Jerusalem on the new frontier. America was still finding its place in the world, in the galaxy, in the order of the universe. The Latter-day Saints were only the first new American religion to emerge in the 19th century that took a measure of inspiration from Swedenborg. In our next essay, we shall examine how three beliefs found in Smith's bricolage developed during the remainder of the 19th century. People lived on other planets. The human race, or races, had evolved out of a mystical past, and the universe was an ordered place. Consistent already with the spirit of the progressive age, these beliefs would receive a new infusion of Eastern spiritualism before America stepped onto the world stage in the 20th century. However, Lynn Hilton shows that today, the old beliefs are still alive among the believers in Joseph Smith, few of whom even recognize the name Emanuel Swedenborg. Thanks and